If you compare beer with bratwurst,
And cheese with wine,
or even whiskey,
with donuts,
then we think you can pair all of these delicious drinks with
murder,
conspiracies
missing persons.
and more.
Drink with us as you feed your craving for true crime and creepy stories.
Hello,
Howdy.
how are you doing, Catherine?
I'm doing well, Jason Stanley.
Dropping my middle name in there, huh?
I don't have a longer name.
No, I don't. I have one name.
One name and one name alone. That's all you need.
Yeah, I've been called Jace before. You call me Jace.
I usually call you Jace.
Yeah, some. I guess I got a couple.
Dropping my legal name. Like you're mad at me.
Yeah, I'd never use that when I say your real name when I'm mad. Cuddy.
With the appropriate inflection.
Yes. Well, we have a lot to get into here.
Yes, but before we jump in, I want to let anybody listening know that this is the second part to a 2-part episode. And if you haven't listened to the first part, I would suggest going back and listening to Jonbenet part 1.
Yeah. And then part 1, we tell the story of how it unfolded.
Yes, we cover the events of Christmas night, the events of Christmas morning, and the days following. We don't really get into any speculation or discussion of evidence, but this crime is almost 30 years old, and I think people probably need a refresher as to the details before appreciating a discussion of evidence.
Yeah, certainly.
So go back.
Yep.
And we'll see you in an hour and a half.
Yeah, definitely listen to that first. We've got a lot to get into here. I just won't even say much more except let's get started.
Yes. So what are we drinking?
Get right on the drinks. So we're going as basic as we can. And
yes.
We are doing my favorite light beer. I believe yours. I don't know if you have a favorite or if you really care. But you do enjoy a light beer and some football together and
I do.
A hot day and a light beer every now and then.
And this is what I would choose.
Yeah.
Because I'm Colorado proud.
Yep. So for Colorado's most infamous unsolved case.
Colorado's literally the crime of the century.
Yeah.
I would say.
Yeah. We will have certainly the beer of the century for Colorado. And
you're welcome to use that, Pete.
That is Coors. Coors Light is what we're drinking from them. Coors was founded in 1873 in Golden, Colorado. Yeah, wild. It goes back that far. And Golden, Colorado, for those that don't know, is just south of Boulder. So Boulder and Golden sit right in front of the Rocky Mountains. Mm-hmm. And I should have looked it up. But they're probably like 15 miles away from each other. And there's one highway that connects them both. And there's not a lot in between the two. So they're almost a stone's throw away from each other. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, here's your Coors Light.
Coors.
Get yourself some Coors.
What a proud Coloradan drinks.
Coors lattes.
Cold as the Rockies.
And the mountains are blue.
So it's nice and cold.
Yeah.
As I'm sure it was December 25th, 1996.
Indeed it was. It's a very cold day.
Tastes just like a Coors Light.
Yeah. Coors was my go-to for the longest time. And I don't think I ever really tried Bud Light and Coors Light next to each other. But I actually kind of liked Bud Light a little bit more.
I'm not sure if I've ever drank Bud Light, to be honest.
Oh, you have.
We used to buy it?
Yeah, I used to buy it. But then I wanted, get Colorado proud again. And so, I kind of gave Coors a chance again. Tried them next to each other again. And I'm actually more of a fan of Coors now.
Well, an unsolved crime that took place in Colorado, Christmas night, possibly Boxing Day, 1996, is perfectly paired with a beer, over 100 years strong in the state of Colorado itself. So let's just jump right in. So hours after finding the lifeless body of their 6-year-old daughter in a room in the basement of their home, strangled with a garrote and a large skull fracture, the result of a significant blow to Jonbenet's head, John and Patsy Ramsey had hired themselves a team of people. Denver attorney Patrick Burke would represent Patty. John would have a separate attorney named Brian Morgan. The couple hired a PR specialist and an attorney named Jim Jenkins to represent the Ramsey family while in Atlanta. The Ramseys even brought onto their team none other than the mind hunter himself, John Douglas, to question the couple, examine the ransom note, and even speak to Boulder police investigators.
Yeah, I read, my refresher actually came from John Douglas's writing. He wrote a book. I'm forgetting the title.
Cases That Haunt Us.
The Cases That Haunt Us. That's it. And it's a bunch of different cases. Uh-huh. There's a chapter on Jonbenet. Now, it's not just like a chapter. It's 2.5 hours of
listening
audible.
Sped up.
Yeah, so it's.
Because I also listened to it.
It covers everything.
It does.
Without any unnecessary stuff in there. And he knows his stuff. He's the man when it comes to...
He's the hunter of minds.
Yeah.
As so it goes.
Which I'm sure everybody that, semi even likes.
Knows John Douglas.
Yeah. Well, maybe not the name, but Mindhunter. Because of the Netflix series that they put out.
Correct. Days after the murder, the family willingly submitted DNA samples. But it wouldn't be until April 30th, 1997, that the parents sat down for an official interview with investigators. The logistics of said interview were stipulated by the Ramsey team. Immediately after the interview, the parents held a press conference to announce their innocence. Neither John nor Patsy Ramsey turned over the clothes they were wearing the night of December 25th or the early hours of the 26th for a full year. When the clothes were turned over to investigators, there was a strong belief that the items alleged to have been worn by Patsy were newly bought. In March of 1998, a grand jury was convened. Jurors spent months looking at the evidence. Now, before moving on, it's time for another legal lesson from a layman. A grand jury only looks at evidence presented by the prosecutor in a case early on to determine if there is probable cause or enough reason to indict someone. In other words, bring charges against them. Unlike criminal court cases, which are constitutionally guaranteed to be public, grand juries are private and the records for them are sealed. The grand jury would indict both parents on 2 separate charges: child abuse and being an accessory to a crime. However, the Boulder County DA, a man named Alex Hunter, declined to file charges against either parent. So let's discuss some of the evidence jurors might have considered, starting with the 911 call. We played the 911 call in its entirety in part 1, or we played what most people believe to be the entirety of Patsy Ramsey's desperate call for help. However, investigators believed that there might be some clues hidden at the end of the call when Patsy thought she had hung up the phone. An aerospace corporation located in Los Angeles, California, filtered extraneous sound from the recording, and what investigators believe to be revealed are the following statements. Patsy is heard saying, "Help me, Jesus. Help me, Jesus." Then either Patsy or a child, most likely Burke, since he was the only child in the home at the time, saying, "What did I do?" or "What did you do?" Then John says in a parental authoritative tone, "We're not talking to you," which makes me believe that the prior statement was indeed said by Burke, if it was said at all. I don't think he would have spoken to Patsy like that. Then a child's voice is heard saying, "What did you find?" If indeed these are the statements made between the 3 living Ramsey family members on the morning of the 26th, after Patsy believed the call to the 911 operator was over, it lends itself to support the family theory. Remember, at the end of the last episode, we briefly discussed that 2 theories quickly emerged during the investigation. Either the family did it or an intruder did it. Seasoned investigators looking at the same evidence would find themselves on different sides of those competing theories. Now back to the 911 call. First, both parents were adamant with investigators that their son Burke was asleep the entire morning until John woke him at 7 a.m. If it is indeed Burke's voice on the end of the recording, then I am left wondering why the parents felt it necessary to lie to police officers. Second, when Burke asks, "What did you do?" or "What did I do?" who is he talking to? Is it his mom or his dad? Or is he rhetorically asking both, like a child often does when their parents seem mad at them, but the child doesn't understand why? What did I do?
Did you ever find that recording, like a good one?
Not a good one. So I remember hearing it while watching a special that we're going to talk about later in 2016.
Yeah.
And they played it while superimposing the phrases. And I think when that happens, your mind maybe connects what it's reading to what it's hearing.
Oh, yeah.
And I've listened to it. I think you definitely can hear Patsy Ramsey saying, "Help me, Jesus, help me, Jesus." I do hear a hint of like, what did you do or what did I do? I hear more, what did I do? And then there's definitely something. But there was nothing that I could play that I think anybody could hear.
Yeah.
But if
Without
you're curious,
those words,
without those words.
Yeah, like a good example of that, and I'm sure most people listening, cruises through reels and whatnot on Instagram, and you get these funny ones that are like a rap song that was popular growing up, and they throw the words of just ridiculous words, but they sound just like it. And you're reading the words and you're literally hearing exactly what that was.
And the only thing that I can go to even just like support maybe this actually is what it's saying is that whatever we have access to isn't maybe what police have access
Which
to.
I'm curious.
Like I doubt we were given the audio recording with that part actually cleaned up. So
I bet it's got to be out there.
I
don't know why.
Very cleaned up version of that.
Yeah. Well, and I don't know why it wouldn't be out here now. And I'm sure even that show probably has like the best version you could if we went back and watched it and just didn't watch the words. But it is, man, for you not to be able to hear it on even the lower quality.
But I think I do hear some of it, and then I'll listen to it again and I don't hear any of it.
Yeah. That's why
I don't know.
Yeah, that's a weird. It's an interesting piece of. I don't even think you could call it evidence because it's opinion. Like it's somebody's opinion that's what's being said, or that there's these noises that are people talking, because it's because you also have the operator asking for Patsy at the same time.
Patsy.
Yeah, so it's like.
Yeah, I don't know.
And phones back then, like it's not the same quality. Like it's not a digital quality. It's I don't know.
I wonder if our younger readers will even know what I mean when I say hung up the phone.
Well, they'll know what it means. They'll just picture a different action, pulling it off your ear
putting
and
it
touching.
on a receiver.
Yeah, touching the red dot.
I don't know. I do think I hear John saying we're not talking to you. I don't know, but then maybe your brain is predisposed to think that's what's being said, so that's what you hear.
Are we talking theories right now, or not theories, but our opinion right now?
You can absolutely give me your opinion for sure.
I just didn't want to interrupt if you had like a.
I mean,
like this, a structure to what we were doing.
No, well, this is going to lead into the first theory of the crime.
Okay, cool.
But you can absolutely tell me what you think about the recording for sure.
Because we've talked about it a bit, and my mind still goes, let's just say that that's being said at the time. Right. But my mind it can't just jump to the conclusion that, the parents did something, there's something crazy happening, because it could easily be Burke.
Burke.
Katie hates it because I always want to call him Berg.
Which isn't even a name.
Like half. They wanted to name him Burger. And, let's do Berg.
Burke is a name.
Burke kind of is too, I guess. So Burke, if he's awake and he says those things, it can easily be just a confused kid seeing his parents like freak out, frantic, just like, what's happening? What's going on? Even the words like, what did you find? Which I think everybody, when you hear this, that, this was on the recording, your mind goes right to, oh, does he know where the body is? Like, did he leave it there? And they're like, well, what did you guys find? I don't buy that. I think she's literally on the phone talking to dispatch about a note she just found. So he hears her saying this, and that's what he's asking about. And the dad, I get this way when things are too crazy and frantic and a kid's trying to talk to me, like you might bark something like, we're not talking to you right now. We're trying to figure this out.
I think like 80% of communication is actually nonverbal or extraverbal. It's not just the words. Mm-hmm. And on a garbled like phone recording, you don't get the extra verbal. So it's the tone inflection. Because what did you find versus what did you find?
Yeah.
Two totally different things.
Yeah.
Like, what did I do versus what did I do? Like, and none of that would be communicated. No. And that's so much a part of what's actually being communicated.
Yeah.
Now, I do want to say, to me, if this is what indeed is being said, then it lends itself to support a family conspiracy to cover up the girl's death. Now, I wrote that before you and I just had the conversation, which then I just want to second guess myself, which is this entire thing. But we're going to move forward.
Let's push forward.
Now, here is where I want to discuss our first, the family did it theory. So in 2016, CBS aired a special titled The Case of Jonbenet Ramsey. And in this multi-part special, which I vividly remember watching while living in our Boulder home, it alleges that the one responsible for Jonbenet's death was none other than Burke Ramsey himself. Now, I want to reiterate that this was an alleged theory, and in no way am I saying that this is what transpired the night. But here is what the theory says. Jonbenet was put to bed after arriving home, but Burke wanted a snack, so his mother made him a bowl of pineapple, which has since come to be described as pineapple in milk, but I have no resource close to the actual investigation to substantiate that bizarre fact.
Yeah, the milk part.
Yeah.
Yeah, even John Douglas just says pineapple.
Yeah, so I have no idea where that came from. But at some point, according to this alleged theory that I am not supporting in one way or another, Jonbenet comes downstairs and eats some of the pineapple out of a bowl that did have both Burke's and Patsy's fingerprints on it. Burke then gets very, very angry. Again, just retelling the theory put forth by the special. He grabs a flashlight, which can be seen in crime scene photos, and hits Jonbenet on the head out of anger. When tested for prints, the flashlight had apparently been completely wiped clean. The family claimed that the flashlight did not belong to any of them, and although it matches those carried by law enforcement officials, no officer on the scene the day of the 26th claimed it as belonging to them. Burke's behavior when being interviewed by a child psychologist did not paint a picture of a distraught older brother whose sister had just died shortly after her death. Burke would also be interviewed in 1998 by detectives, and during that interview, he never said anything specifically incriminating. Ultimately, Burke Ramsey would sue CBS for $750 million because of the special.
Holy cow, I didn't know that.
So again, I reiterate, what I have just described is simply a theory put forward by a television special.
Disclaimer.
Now, in all truth, this line of thinking, supported by evidence, makes quite a bit of sense to me. However, what doesn't make sense is this. John and Patsy were both well-educated, very capable people. I can't envision their response to an accident would be a giant cover-up to protect a son who most likely wouldn't suffer criminal consequences. The family also had the means to get Burke whatever mental health he would require after such a horrific accident, and if need be, they could completely relocate and move if the stigma of such an incident made it impossible for them to continue living in Boulder, Colorado.
Yeah. I do remember that show.
I bought it
vividly.
hook, line, and sinker.
Yeah, they did a really good job. And you could totally, like, now thinking back to it, I'm like, yeah, you were going to sue the shit out of us.
And he did.
CBS, right?
And they settled.
They did settle. Oh, so he definitely came out.
Undisclosed amount.
Probably at least half, my guess. But
enough to create a new identity and probably live happy, never having to work a day in his life. So.
Yeah. Well, and he was already probably, I mean, not living happy because of all this, but he was a rich man, very, very successful. But that I think is a great point. Very successful people, very smart people. And it just covering for Burke doesn't make sense in the way that it was done. I mean, if it is a cover up, but all the evidence, everything, the way everything unfolded, it makes zero sense that they would come up with something so elaborate and hodgepodge.
Sadistic.
It's like so many different thoughts, and it's just like, fuck it, do them all. There's also, here's the thing. The only way that works, I think, because there is nobody has come out during all this and said that the parents had past a history of beating their children or even being mean. Like, everybody described them as loving parents. And for those types of parents, and really most any parent outside of maybe 0.5% that are awful and do end up killing their kids, everybody else, they would not be able to take their child's dead body and put a garrote around it and tighten it as tight as it was tightened and bound the child's hands of their dead child. So the only way it works is that Burke would have had to do that. He's 10 years old, and he's 9. Or yeah, I thought he was 10.
He's 9.
Okay.
6 and 9.
Yeah. So even so, a 9-year-old having the wherewithal to do all that.
I will just interject, just because this case doesn't make sense unless you have evidence presented to like counter everything anybody ever says. Jonbenet did go to see her pediatrician within like 18 months of her murder because Burke had hit her in the face with a golf club.
Well,
so, I don't even know.
He still is a little boy, and I don't put it past. I'm just waiting for our son to hit one of our daughters hard in the face.
He hit her TV, so
yeah. But here, that's right. Even better point that he doesn't have the strength to take a flashlight and do the type of blow that he did, because he had already hit her with something that you don't need as much strength, because that's the way a golf club is made. Anyway.
Well, John had survived the surprise loss of his older daughter, Beth, and Patsy, which I have to correct. I said Patty. You don't understand. I was just reading last episode and I called her Patty a couple times. Excuse me. Patsy had the mental fortitude to fight a cancer that should have killed her. This couple was clearly strong enough to withstand such a scenario as presented in the CBS special. The next piece of evidence we need to discuss is the 3-page ransom note left on the back stairs, which was discovered by Patsy that early morning of the 26th. There were a few things that immediately stood out to investigators about the ransom note, which Jason read in its entirety in part 1. First, the writing appeared to be done in a way that the author was trying to hide their handwriting. For example, the author could have been using a non-dominant hand, or intentionally drawing characters in a way that they believed was different from how they normally wrote. Second, the length of the ransom note was excessive, especially considering that the author would have written it in the home, which we will discuss later. There were words and phrases that were unnecessary, like the introductory phrase, "We are a group of individuals," which when you think about it, most groups are made up of individuals. There were also all of the random stipulations, like talking to a strange dog, that would warrant the alleged kidnappers killing Jonbenet. Investigators also noted that the author vacillates between using I and we when referring to what had happened or what would happen. Had what happened to Jonbenet ever been an actual kidnapping for financial gain? Was there one perpetrator or more perpetrators? The investigators found the amount requested to be interesting as well. John Ramsey was worth roughly $6 million, but the amount is very small compared to what the Ramseys could have potentially paid.
You told me $6 million back then was, you had the number.
I don't think I did. Normally I do those calculations.
Yeah. Oh, it was a lot more in 96 than $6 million is still a lot now, but
a crap ton of money.
Yeah. You're talking
in almost 2024.
Yeah. But even now it'd probably be, 15 million,
significant.
20 million.
Also, the amount itself is random, or it seemed random until officers were informed it was nearly the exact amount of John Ramsey's bonus that year, indicating that the author could have known that was an amount recently received. That wasn't the only detail in the note that revealed the author must be at least somewhat familiar with the Ramseys. Using the phrase Southern common sense communicated that they were aware that John was originally from a Southern state. So on December 26th, officers at the house would ask John and Patsy Ramsey for anything that they could use to compare to the handwriting in the ransom note. John would grab 2 white pads of paper from the home. Atop the first page on one, he would write John. That pad of papers was full of his work notes. On the other, he would write Patsy, that pad full of doodles, lists, and notes made by Jonbenet's mother. These 2 pads of paper were taken to police headquarters for comparison.
I just want to say, what a different world we live in now.
Right.
Like, who do you know that has his and hers pads of papers just right there in the kitchen because that's what you need.
No, you and I argue over whether we're going to have a paper calendar or a digital calendar, and then we have 0 calendars.
I'm the digital side.
I am
if
not.
You didn't guess.
I am not. You should see my handwritten notes for these podcast episodes. Now, one of the pads of paper would reveal something very interesting. On a piece of paper in Patsy's pad was a sheet of paper with the following line written, Mr. and Mrs., and then a single vertical line. Presumably the vertical line, the beginning of the letter R. What police would hypothesize is that this was the first attempt at a ransom note. Handwriting comparisons were done. John was excluded as the author of the note, but Patsy could not be excluded. According to Steve Thomas, one of the lead investigators on the case, one CBI, or the Colorado Bureau of Investigations, agent. I didn't write in that I was going to explain what CBI meant, but that's what it means.
If you're not from Colorado, you might not know CBI.
An agent from the Colorado Bureau of Investigations reported that 24 of the 26 characters in the note belonged to Patsy Ramsey. It also didn't help Patsy that the pad of paper used to write the note and the pen with which it was written belonged to Patsy herself and were in the home the night of Jonbenet's death, meaning that if someone entered the home that night with the hopes of kidnapping Jonbenet for financial gain, they did so with no ransom note and nothing with which to write one.
Yeah, that's over the years, that's one of those things. Every time I watch a documentary or hear about it, like, we're talking about it or something, that being brought up, I'm always like, geez, how do you explain that, Patsy?
Well, to many, there did not seem to be a reasonable explanation. The ransom seemed like a second thought. Like ransom was never a goal in what happened to Jonbenet. For most involved with the case, it seemed unlikely that an intruder would feel comfortable enough in a home to not only look for things with which to write a ransom note, but to also spend the time it would take to write 2.5 pages worth of one. The ransom note quickly cast even more eyes upon the Ramseys, specifically Patsy. I literally remember hearing during the initial investigation as a young child living in the state of Colorado, the person who wrote the letter is the same person who killed Jonbenet, and that person was Patsy Ramsey.
I remember hearing that too.
Yes.
Yeah. But even now that we have looked into this a lot, you more than myself, but and also being parents, older, just a different perspective to look at this case from again. And the more I think you can explain away that, like, the characters that were similar to Patsy's. It is literally what I just said about what a different time. In a kitchen, you have his and hers notepads. And let's just say maybe this person was actually going to kidnap her. They weren't strong enough to get her out the window or something like that, and just decided to do what they were going to do there. Either way, if an intruder came in and decided to write a ransom note, which John Douglas hypothesizes that it is possible this person had already written a letter and brought it, or forgot it and had to rewrite it. And so they had to go upstairs, find these pads of papers, and guess what? Oh, there's Patsy's pad. Mm-hmm. There's all I don't even have to think of character. I could just look over at the pad there and fake my handwriting based off of that.
Well, and John Douglas had a very different impression as to the person who wrote the letter. And I don't know if you want to speak to what he said, but when he described the author of the ransom note, it definitely wasn't a 40-something-year-old suburban housewife who was into pageants. He described somebody else. Do you remember what he said?
It's a younger white male,
yes.
Probably in their early 20s or so. And I think he attributes that to, which I thought this was so key of what he said in his book, because I thought it when I heard the letter again for the first time in like 6 years, I kept thinking, it sounds like it's straight out of a movie. Like, this letter is ridiculous. And his theory is that a younger male is going to have like movie lines in their head already, or if he wrote it before, like looked for those movie lines, like, okay, you talk to a stray dog, we're gonna kill her.
Yeah. There's also a line that comes from, I think, Speed in the ransom note, which is, don't try to grow a brain, John.
Yep.
Which I actually can see Patsy being more of a fan of than some 20-something-year-old white male. But so I didn't talk about this at all in my script, but the sign off where it says Victory SBTC, like, investigators were like, that's the acronym for a naval base where John lived. But John Douglas said that wasn't even the name of the naval base at the time. And there was like a plaque in the Jonbenet and the Ramsey household that said SBTC, which I didn't really find conclusive. But if anybody is bored, there is a theory about, so CU, the campus, is literally a 4-minute drive from where the Ramseys lived.
If that. And it's like a 4-minute walk almost.
In 1996, there was some math paper that was written of some sort of theory, and the acronyms was SBTC. And on the internet, there's some guy who speculates that the authors of this paper, or individuals who knew about this paper, had something to do with Jonbenet's death.
Interesting.
But this case, you can find evidence to explain anything. But I just wanted to point that out now that we were talking about it.
Yeah. No, I didn't know about that CU. Or maybe I did, but I didn't remember.
It's all just bizarre.
Yeah, CU is right there.
Yeah.
And another, I'm sure we'll have an, go on, actually.
Okay. So one of the lead detectives, Steve Thomas, is going to base his theory a lot on the notion that Patsy Ramsey wrote the ransom letter. This theory pointed directly at Jonbenet's mom. Now, while searching through the house the morning of the 26th, a large bag of diapers was noted hanging out of a cabinet near Jonbenet's bedroom. It was also reported to the investigators that in recent months leading to her death, Jonbenet was struggling with wetting, even soiling her bed. When first answering questions about how Jonbenet was put to bed, Patsy reportedly told investigators that Jonbenet went to bed in a red top. But when her body was found, she was wearing white. A red shirt was spotted rolled up on the counter by a sink in the bathroom. Further, when Steve Thomas, the investigator, interviewed Patsy's mother, Nedra, he felt that when he broached the subject of bedwetting, she became incredibly elusive. Thomas would formulate a theory where Patsy Ramsey became enraged on Christmas night after again Jonbenet wet herself. His theory goes Patsy took Jonbenet into the bathroom and stripped off the red top, and in doing so, possibly yanked too hard, causing Jonbenet to hit her head, perhaps on the side of the bathtub, causing the head wound. What followed was Patsy doing everything else to stage the scene, including writing the note. He will point to the fact that in the morning when officers arrived, Patsy was wearing the same outfit she wore to the party on Christmas night, but her hair and makeup had been done, which to him indicated a woman who had never changed out of her clothes. Why would she do her hair and makeup to only hurriedly put on a dirty outfit? Now, one issue with this theory is that the hit to Jonbenet's head was so hard it could have killed, and you're going to say a 700-pound man.
400.
400. Okay. So in my head, I was like, 700-pound men don't exist. So I wrote 400. But I remember you saying
No.
Okay. A 400-pound man. It's hard to imagine any accidental fall that would result in that type of force.
It would. She'd have to, like, sling her into it. Like,
Yeah.
it wouldn't be, because she's not heavy enough to produce that force on herself. Gravity wouldn't allow that, I don't think.
Yeah.
I think a 400-pound man would have to fall for it to kill a 400-pound man.
Dang, that's a big man.
Yeah.
Now, there were other clues in the note that made investigators look outside of the family did it theory. Like looking at former employees of John's company.
You're going on to the next.
We're still talking about the note, which I can't say. I mean, I think overall it indicates that Patsy had some involvement.
Okay.
But there were
Are
clues.
you going on to, okay. But you are going on to, like, if it happened outside of Patsy?
Yes.
Okay. First, I just want to throw one more thing.
Well, we're going to go back and forth because
we are?
The evidence,
okay,
depending on your perspective, could explain anybody did it.
Yeah. I'll just say it anyway. Since we were just there, again, for Patsy to have done it, she would have to think of a garrote, first of all, like who thinks of that in general. Make a garrote, put it on her dead child, twist. Also, the kid is actually alive because
most likely unconscious.
they're so
though.
Yeah, but they're so like the blow to the head and the strangulation
Pretty close.
so close that it's not like definitive which one did it.
Well, we're going to talk about the garrote and how it's not actually a garrote. There's just so many things.
Okay, but even so, she would have to do that
Correct.
on her dead or what she thinks is a dead child.
I think my husband is very pro an intruder did it theory, which is fine.
No, I'm pro another thing.
Yes, we'll get there. So, like I said, there were other clues in the note that caused investigators to look outside of the home for possible suspects. For example, John's business is specifically mentioned in the ransom note, and the amount requested was possibly connected to two specific former employees, Bud and Brenda Henderson, who each owed Access Graphics $18,000, which is just $100,000 off the ransom amount, were investigated.
Oh, that's interesting. Because 100,000 seems reasonable for somebody to
just to add,
ask, like, especially if they're not,
we can pay back our 18,000 plus have an additional 100,000. Now, Brenda, I believe, was in a halfway house the night of the crime, but Bud's alibi was very, very questionable.
Oh, really?
But just like all of the other disgruntled employees, Bud and Brenda would be excluded from the suspect list eventually.
Huh. Wonder, did you see the reason
I'm
for
sure
Bud?
it's the DNA, which we'll talk about.
Get into.
Now, supporters of the intruder theory would point to the broken window in the basement and a scuff mark below the window. But during the early days of the investigation, John would admit that he had broken the window months before when he had locked himself out of the home. The suitcase below the window would be pinpointed to as a tool the intruder could have used to escape the basement. But then there was the report that Fleet White was responsible for putting the suitcase below the broken window.
Which is weird. I don't even understand why they pointed to the suitcase as something somebody could get out of. We've seen pictures of the house,
a briefcase type suitcase.
Yeah, and it probably isn't holding a grown man, or it's gonna break, and and B, you saw the pictures that I showed you of the house it's listed right now.
It's currently for sale, and if you go on Zillow,
you could find it.
You can find it
and see all the pictures. We actually went and looked at it, and it put whole nother perspective.
And it completely changed my opinion about the entire case, and I can't explain why.
I think it's the size of the house. It's just like...
It's massive, because we talked about it in the first episode, how the pictures that were like broadcasted everywhere shows a reasonable sized home.
And then you read it's over 5,000 square feet, which actually on Zillow says over 6,000. I don't know if there's an addition.
To the sides, and it just continues to extend backwards towards the alley. And it's like 3 different like architectural homes all put together, which people reported like all the work that had been done.
Yep.
Created a very hodgepodge, mazy type home.
Yeah. But it still has this like unique coolness to it, but also it makes it sort of creepy. Just knowing that this happened in it.
It was all creepy.
But yeah, it literally is 3 levels above ground. It's not like a lot of people think of a 3-story house as basement, main, second level.
Right.
No, this is 3. It's big. It's giant. And it gives you a different perspective of how something could happen in the basement, and where the master room, which is part of up in the attic area, how they wouldn't hear anything.
Well, and there was sort of a venting tube outside of that like cellar room, the wine room, where we had the report from a neighbor who said she heard a scream somewhere between 12 and 2.
Yeah.
And investigators tested it. Like they went one night and were doing like scenarios inside the home to try to figure out.
Yeah.
And if Jonbenet screamed in the basement, it's more likely that a neighbor outside would have heard it than her parents upstairs. Now, they also went on to say like an intruder would have no idea that the parents wouldn't have heard that scream. To any intruder would be like, oh my gosh, the child screamed. I need to get out of here.
True. Right. And maybe they did.
Yeah.
Yeah. Maybe
that's the quick blow to the head.
Maybe they were going to do some dirty things, kidnap her and leave, and she screamed.
And he had to figure it out.
Maybe we just solved it.
No, your solution at the end is the only thing that will explain it all.
Right.
Now, some say just because John broke the window, that does not mean an intruder could not have used it to enter or exit the home. But investigators would point to an intact spider's web in the window, which would make it unlikely anyone had traveled through it. Now, let's move on to the evidence from the autopsy, starting with the duct tape, the white cord around Jonbenet's wrists and neck, and the wooden stick used to fashion the garrote. Now, the garrote, it was determined, was made from a paintbrush taken out of Patsy's art supplies in the basement. And the garrote itself was not a traditional garrote. Instead, the cord connected to the stick was actually a noose that was put around Jonbenet's neck, And the stick added second to simply tighten the noose.
But isn't that's what a garrote does?
It doesn't.
It's a loop
Without
thrown over,
the
and then you
noose,
tighten, and it tightens.
The noose feature.
Well,
I don't think
I guess
you
the noose
need
tie,
a noose.
But maybe that's all they could. Like they weren't the smartest, crayon in the box.
Well,
no, I know that's brightest, but they just want to make you laugh.
They're not the sharpest bulb on the Christmas tree.
They're not the brightest tool in the shed.
Okay.
Actually, that one might work.
I don't.
Flashlights.
There's flashlights. Dun, dun, dun. Now, this notion of a garrote stick added to a noose, which with a child who was presumably already unconscious due to the head injury, this noose itself would have been complete overkill. And then you add the additional unnecessary component of the garrote. Some saw staging of a crime, while others saw angry sadism. Another piece of evidence which could be used to support either theory. The family did it, or it was an intruder. Next, when investigators tried to tie the white cord or the duct tape to having an origin from within the home, like the garrote stick, investigators could not conclusively do so.
What's interesting, because I've heard you say both cord and rope when we're talking about it, and it's if you look at the pictures, which I don't suggest doing, unless it's just the items by themselves, it's definitely more of a rope. Mm-hmm. And one thing I thought of was it could be a rope from like sweatpants or a hoodie.
What's crazy is they have done like tireless, like actual laboratory investigations to determine the exact kind of duct tape, the brand, the manufacturer. The cord was different. And I say cord because that's what a lot of my sources say. For the longest time, they kept saying it was a certain kind of cord. And then when they got an expert to look at it, they were like, no, this is a different kind of cord.
Weird.
So like the duct tape, they pinpointed to a type, Sure tape, I think, by Braun.
Yeah.
The cord was different.
Which, I mean, I get why I call it a cord because it's like too small to be a rope, but it's definitely like thread material. It's rope-like.
No, I think
that's all I could think of. The only thing, I mean, maybe like arts and crafts stuff, but if it was something somebody just needed to use quickly, that's what I was like, oh well, I don't know, a shirt, a hoodie, sweatpants.
I did find it interesting
your rope in there.
The autopsy described frayed ends, which to me is somebody like took a knife and cut it off of a larger spool.
Yeah, which
they couldn't find the spool in the house.
Spool and of all, like, okay, let's say it was staged by somebody in the house.
What?
Why would you just get rid of that? Why wouldn't you get rid of the notepads and the pen and everything else you use to stage this?
Investigators also use technology to like look behind walls to see if they could find remnants of the duct tape or the cord, which I wasn't going to include, but we're just off the cuff discussing. They couldn't find it.
That's what we promised everybody.
Yes. Now, when investigators tried to tie the white cord or duct tape to having an origin from within the home, like the garrote sticks, investigators could not do so, like I said. However, Boulder police did find strips of similar black duct tape behind a picture hanging in Jonbenet's bedroom. But there was no specific spool that they couldn't connect the tape from her mouth to having been found inside the home. There also was no source of the white cord or rope to be found within the home either. However, investigators would discover that Patsy Ramsey had visited McGuckin's Hardware on 2 occasions at the beginning of December.
Good old McGuckin's.
Mm-hmm.
That's for those that don't know, a hardware store in Boulder. I don't think it's a chain. I think it's just, it might be. I should look that up. Anyway, that's what it is. Hardware store.
In Boulder. Now, Patsy Ramsey had purchased items that cost the same amount as both similar duct tape and cord, $2.29. But since the receipt from McGuckins only listed the price and the department from which the item was purchased, it could not be concluded that Patsy had in fact purchased duct tape or white cord.
But they said they can't figure out where this white cord comes from. So how do they say, like, how do they put a price on?
Well, they went to McGuckins and they found similar products that were $2.29.
Okay.
And then they identified receipts from Patsy Ramsey that had items being purchased from the departments where both the duct tape and the white cord would have been purchased from, listed at the same price as the duct tape and the white cord.
Well, I'm guessing they ruled out that cord then because they did all this testing on the cord and couldn't figure it out. I'm sure somebody was like, well, here's something from McGuckins that's like that. Is it the same? And then they were like, no, it's not.
I think once they figured out they wouldn't be able to determine which product was purchased, those receipts were a lost cause.
Interesting.
For many, the duct tape and the cord clearly supports an intruder theory. Now, there was also the handprint on the cellar door, but when we clarify that piece of evidence, there were actually 3 palm prints taken from the door, 2 of which belonged to Patsy, leaving 1 which could not be tied to anyone that had provided palm prints for testing. The boot print taken from next to where the body was found was actually taken from 3 separate boot prints that were all overlapping. Later in the investigation, it would be concluded that there was an FBI agent who had been in the home with the same high-tech boots as the print indicated. But as far as I can tell, those boots were never compared to the print from the floor. If we look at those 4 pieces of evidence at face value, the duct tape, the white cord, the palm print, and the boot print, they are very suggestive of an intruder. And there was never a shortage of possible intruder suspects.
Well, and what's interesting with everything you just talked about with each item and the testing and whatnot that was done on them, it just leads me just more like almost anger towards Boulder PD and how inept they were. Like, so bad. Literally, the second one of their police officers, like, their foot hit inside the house, that case was fucked.
Yeah. I also find it really interesting, as I was listening to one of the books, the author would say that once the case got as big as it got in terms of media coverage, most individuals were unwilling to give prints, were unwilling to say, hey, I could have left that. That could be mine, because they wanted nothing to do with the media circus that became the Jonbenet Ramsey case.
And the beginning of that was, go ahead and invite your friends over into this crime scene minutes after us, the Boulder PD, got here.
Really, and every piece of evidence could have been questioned either by the prosecution or defense attorneys as not being valid or reliable.
We know what it's like to have a lot of friends in a neighborhood.
Right.
And how fast word can spread.
Yeah.
You know how quick that's going to the media? Like, had the Boulder PD done it correct, they would have had the time to do the right investigation. And also, had they, taken the offering of help from Denver PD, from the FBI, they would have done it correct.
I will also say, when Boulder PD tried to make moves to probably mitigate the damage that their department had done, the DA's office wasn't really willing to entertain those moves, because there was an incredibly adversarial relationship between the chief of police, who was removed. Well, he left his post during the course of this investigation, and the prosecutor's office. And politics absolutely had a detrimental effect on a potential outcome.
Yeah. I, even with all of that, like that, once Boulder decided, okay, we're going to do it right, they already screwed it up. Plus, they couldn't go back and fix things because of that relationship. But had they done it right in the beginning, I don't think that relationship between the DA or the prosecutor's office and Boulder PD would have played any part in it.
It's just Boulder is its own little world.
Its own republic.
Where strange things happen. So Patsy Ramsey herself was very quick to point to none other than the Ramseys' own housekeeper as a possible suspect. Linda Hoffman Pugh had recently asked to borrow money from the Ramseys, about $2,000, which could suggest the financial motive that was present in the ransom note. However, when interviewed by officers and their DNA was tested, both Linda and her husband were cleared.
I'm sure they had a good alibi as well. I don't know. I thought that was...
I don't know. Linda's husband seems like a riot, though. Apparently, he was drunk when he was interviewed the first time. And just like a bit of a mess.
Well, it's Christmas. He's partying it up.
Now, during Linda's interview, so the housekeeper's interview, she provided officers with something else to consider. Perhaps it was someone who had seen Jonbenet in one of her beauty pageants, who became obsessed with the young girl who, in her costumes and pageant outfits, seemed like a much more mature individual. Investigators narrowed in on a known sex offender living in Boulder at the time of Jonbenet's murder. Gary Olivia was a 32-year-old man who was apprehended for drugs when officers found a cutout of a magazine picture of Jonbenet in his backpack. Things looked worse for Olivia when a high school friend of his, Michael Vale, came forward with a tip, saying he had actually received a call from Olivia in which Olivia admitted that he had hurt a little girl. Furthermore, Olivia had attempted to strangle his own mother using a rope tied with knots eerily similar to the ones in the rope or cord used to strangle Jonbenet. Olivia would, however, be excluded using DNA.
It was just DNA with him? I thought there was no alibi that excluded him.
No, that's for another piece of crap later on in the story.
Okay. Did you see anything of what Olivia said he was doing that night? Or
I didn't, but
he didn't say he did, right? Like he never
admitted to doing it. I don't know what his alibi was. I'm not sure he knows what his alibi was.
Yeah, right.
But I think eventually DNA became the telltale sign, and when compared to the DNA they had, Olivia didn't match, so he was free to go. Next, I think we need to look at the evidence regarding a possible sexual component to the crime. These were the hardest details to navigate when reading the autopsy report. Now, the autopsy describes chronic and acute injuries to Jonbenet's genitalia. At the time of her death, her hymen was not intact. There was blood and an abrasion on Jonbenet's vaginal wall, which indicated some type of penetration, just not with a penis. A panel of pediatric experts would ultimately conclude that Jonbenet suffered vaginal trauma prior to the day she was murdered. However, other experts would conclude that the damage to Jonbenet's genitalia might have only occurred the evening of her death.
This case...
Just inconclusive. One side says this, another side says the other thing.
Every single thing.
Mm-hmm.
It could be both.
Yeah. Now, the autopsy also revealed microscopic birefringent foreign material in the vagina, which was examined under a microscope, appeared to be wood or perhaps the varnish from the wood handle that was used to make the garrote, suggesting that could have been the tool for penetration. Now, with these indicators that sexual abuse could have occurred prior to December 25th or the 26th, a theory developed that perhaps John Ramsey had been abusing his daughter, and to cover it up, he murdered her. So another piece of evidence to support the family did it. This theory was the reason why CDs, CD-ROMs, computers, tapes, and other sources of digital media were taken from the home. And when examined, there was no evidence of child pornography or any violence against children in any form. Also, when interviewing family and friends, no one indicated that John was even capable of hurting his daughter like that. To be honest, I feel that John is the least mentioned family member when attempting to explain the nights of the 25th or the morning of the 26th.
Yeah. And there's I forget who John Douglas mentioned. It was right when he was getting started with the case. And I think it was the FBI guy who basically just dealt with pedophiles. Mm-hmm. And he said, John doesn't match any description or has no tendencies of what I see of a potential pedophile. So it was like right away, John went into it, which he went into it with an open mind. He did not go into it like, I'm going to prove the family didn't do this. He was, in his mind, the family did do it just based off the beginning stuff. And except maybe that John
did it for sexual reasons.
Yeah.
Now, if sexual abuse had not been occurring prior to that night, but there was a sexual component to the crime, that would lend itself to an intruder theory. This is where I want to discuss Santa Claus himself, or Bill McReynolds as Santa Claus. Now, Bill McReynolds had played Santa Claus at a party at the Ramseys' home days before Christmas. The relationship between Bill and Jonbenet was perhaps unusual. At one point, Jonbenet provided Bill with a small trinket full of glitter, and Bill expressed that he would like his ashes to be mixed with it when he eventually passed away. After Jonbenet's body was found, investigators would be told that Bill had told Jonbenet Santa would visit and bring her a surprise after Christmas. But when looking at the aged man, Boulder PD was not convinced he physically was capable of doing what had to be done to Jonbenet, including carrying her down to the basement. But they investigated Bill nonetheless. And as they investigated, they found some disturbing coincidences. For one, Janet McReynolds, Bill's wife, or Mrs. Claus, had written a play in which a young girl was tortured and killed in a basement. Then investigators discovered that on December 26th, 1974, the 9-year-old daughter of the McReynolds had actually been kidnapped herself.
What?
Their daughter was taken along with another young girl to a separate location where the other girl was sexually abused before both girls were released. The investigators would even look at the McReynolds' sons, one of whom had issues with the law, but they would be excluded, some with DNA evidence, others using alibis.
That's so crazy. Another another addition to just how wild everything is in this. Like it could be anybody and everybody. Like everybody.
And nobody and no one.
Right. Like everyone has some sort of weird tie to possibly, being the one that did it, whether it be a book somebody wrote about like the same thing happening or
it's insane.
Or kidnapping on the day that, she was supposedly supposed to be kidnapped.
Later or something.
So crazy.
All right. Then.
I did want to say.
Okay.
Sorry.
No, that's fine.
You did bring up something about him, like if you're an old man bringing down the body to the basement, which one reason I wanted to mention how big the house actually is like being upright, looking at it in person, yeah, that's a lot of stairs you'd be going down.
Well,
and what's crazy is like, I don't ever hear it mentioned, like she had to be taken from her room. And I saw a lot of pictures of her room, but I don't hear people talk about like anything found in her room or how like no theory of how she was brought out.
So I do have a couple of notes on that. For one, I think it was even John Ramsey himself who, when talking about Bill McReynolds, he said that if his daughter was awoken in her room by anybody, she would scream and yell and kick, unless it was Santa Claus. And so he said Santa Claus could get her downstairs without a commotion. But,
or carrying her.
But during her autopsy, They removed green material from her hair, which matched the garland down the staircase she would have had to traveled.
Yeah.
So they concluded she didn't walk down those stairs. She was carried down those stairs, and that's how the garland got in her hair. And so those two statements can't both be true. That Santa Claus got her to walk down the stairs quietly by herself, or she also had to be carried down the stairs.
Was the garland on a railing?
It was on the railing.
That's like the height of her.
But no, if you're carrying her this way.
No, I think it's way more feasible for garland to get in her hair because you're being carried and your hair's dripping down. But
yeah.
And maybe it was the placement of where it was in the hair. But at the same time, like, I don't know. 6-year-old is at least railing height. Like,
yeah, but it's not like she's bumping her head along the
unless
railing.
She's all happy and kind of prancing down. Her hair's bopping back and forth. I don't know. I just try and look at both sides.
Right.
Anyway.
No, this case is two-sided and both sides make complete and total sense. And
nothing makes sense.
So then in 2008, the results of a series of DNA tests would be revealed, and the results would be enough, according to the new DA of Boulder, Mary T. Lacey, to write a letter of apology to the Ramseys, officially excluding them as suspects. This apology, however, would come too late for Patsy Ramsey, who had succumbed in 2006 to the cancer which had reemerged. Now, here is what I physically see in the DNA test results. So DNA was taken from a blood stain on Jonbenet's shirt, retrieved from the duct tape pulled from Jonbenet's mouth, from the blood stain on the white blanket, and from the blood stains from the nightgown, all belonging to Jonbenet herself. The DNA taken from semen stains on the black blanket, which I believe was retrieved from inside the suitcase, could not be developed into any DNA profile. However, there was DNA which came from the epithelial fractions or skin cells off of the same blanket, which was consistent as being a mixture from John and Patsy Ramsey, which suggests a plausible explanation for the semen. The couple in a blanket. Doing what couples do.
I was like, huh? Yeah, I should have gotten that a lot quicker. Yep.
So this leaves us with the DNA, which was recovered from beneath Jonbenet's fingernails and the blood stain on Jonbenet's underwear. Now, in the previous episode, I said Jonbenet was found wearing long underwear, like long johns, and then I referred to her panties as underwear. There was a separate pair of underpants. These were taken from her underpants or her panties. Now, the major DNA component from each of those sources, her fingernails and her underpants, belonged to Jonbenet.
Mm-hmm.
But for the next part, let me read directly from the report. If the minor components from exhibits number 7, 14L, and 14M were contributed by a single individual, then John Andrew Ramsey, Melinda Ramsey, John B. Ramsey, Patricia Ramsey, Burke Ramsey, Jeff Ramsey, John Fernie, Priscilla White, and Mervyn Pugh would be excluded as a source of the DNA analyzed on those exhibits. Now, number 7, the DNA, came from the blood stain on Jonbenet's underpants. That does not mean that the DNA was taken from a blood source. It could simply mean that they retrieved Jonbenet's blood as a source of DNA and found in it touched DNA from somebody else. Now, 14L and 14M refers to the DNA taken from under the fingernails on each of her hands. Presumably, it was those 3 sources of DNA that were used to exclude the most sensational suspect to date in the Jonbenet Ramsey murder case. Writing under the name Daxus, John Mark Carr sent emails to CU journalism professor Michael Tracy, in which he described in detail his love for Jonbenet, as well as what transpired the night Jonbenet was killed. The relationship between Daxus and the journalism professor Tracy, it developed enough that phone calls even transpired between the two, in which Daxus described strangling Jonbenet. And at that description, Tracy would later recall it to have been one of the darkest moments of his own life. Simply at listening to this man describe that moment.
I imagine. He also said that Daxus, or what's his actual name?
John Mark Carr.
John Mark Carr. That Carr had details that only the murderer would know, which I never heard what details those were. I watched, he didn't say what those details were, and I'm like,
I think Daxus filled in details that, if true, would only have come from the murderer. I don't think he provided details that connected to evidence that hadn't been released yet.
And this was in 2000s, 2003, something like that?
Oh, no, it was
2006?
Hey.
You think it was later?
Yeah, it definitely was later.
So by this time, all the details are out there. Like, I mean, unless we don't know, there might be some details.
That
Boulder PD is still just waiting. Like, this, if they know this, then that's the person that did it.
Now, Daxus would say that he accidentally strangled the 6-year-old during sex and wound up hitting her on the head with a flashlight. A team of investigative agencies, which even included the Secret Service, tracked Daxus down to living in Thailand. And Daxus, actually a man named John Mark Carr, would be extradited to the United States. DNA testing would exclude Carr. His wife at the time also reported that during Christmas of 1996, Carr was with her celebrating in Alabama. Ultimately, no charges were filed against Carr in Jonbenet's murder. Also, possible charges against Carr for child pornography would eventually be dropped.
Oh, I didn't know that those were dropped. Those were in California, weren't they?
I don't know where they were. I thought he was serving a sentence, but they were dropped. And as of 2010, Carr was reportedly living as a woman, identifying herself as Alexis Valoran Reich or Delia Alexis Reich.
Sounds right. Okay. So he was completely excluded just because of the DNA.
Just because of DNA.
And you have more to tell us about
We're going to go
DNA,
right into it.
Yeah.
Here is where I struggle with the DNA evidence. Taken from the report itself, the use of the phrase, quote, if the minor components from exhibits 7, 14L, 14M were contributed by a single individual, then it lists all those people to be excluded, makes me very uneasy.
That wording is not conclusive at all.
What if the DNA doesn't come from one individual? Can all of the individuals mentioned in the report still be excluded? And if they can't, then what? Are we back to the drawing board? Are we back to square one? Perhaps there is another report that says the DNA below Jonbenet's nails is the same from the source as the DNA taken from her underwear. So this is a whole nother issue. However, I doubt this. In the book titled Perfect Down, Perfect Murder, by an author named Lawrence Shiller, the author makes the statement that when the housekeeper's husband, Mervyn Pugh, when his DNA was tested against the DNA from beneath the fingerprints, it didn't match. And then it was tested against the DNA from the underwear and didn't match. Suggesting that this author, who is much better researched than myself, is under the impression that the DNA from the fingernails and the underpants isn't actually from the same source. So do we have two killers? Or is the DNA from one of those sources the killer and the other from an innocent source? If that's true, how will we know which is which? But let's say it is the same DNA profile on Jonbenet's underpants and beneath her fingerprints or her fingernails. If I've said fingerprints, I apologize.
Yeah,
I mean fingernails.
I think that was the first one.
What if the DNA from beneath her fingernails winds up on Jonbenet's underwear because as a 6-year-old girl with an issue of wetting her bed, she simply was itching beneath her underwear when she deposited the minor contribution to her underwear, which was then collected along with the DNA from her own blood that wound up on her underwear during the attack. This DNA, which could have come from a variety of innocent sources, winding up below Jonbenet's fingernails, which isn't blood evidence, could literally have come from a dozen other places, none of which came from the murderer, his or herself.
Is that DNA considered touch DNA?
So I don't know about the DNA below her fingernails. However, there was one Fox News article that said literally could have been deposited there with her playing in dirt.
Right.
So to me, it's not blood DNA. So anything that's not blood DNA, I'm not sure if it's touch. Blood DNA, it's somebody's blood dripped in her finger. Like she scratched her killer, his blood dripped on her underwear. None of it is blood DNA.
I would, and the reason I wonder if it touch DNA is different than, let's say you scratched the killer, didn't get blood, but you have skin.
Epithelial.
Yeah. So it's got to be a little bit different because touch DNA can literally be you grab somebody's arm and you've left a little bit of skin cells, I guess.
But then I go back to the fact, why are you testing a suspect's DNA against both? If they're the same, wouldn't you just test them against one?
Right.
So to me, there's nothing in the report release that said it's the same.
Yep. Because they said if it's from the same.
Indicates that it's...
Yeah, even the way that what you were saying, the phrase that bothers you the most,
if it comes from one individual,
if it comes from one individual, like they are literally saying in that we are not saying it comes from the same individual.
Yep, and neither did the CBI. So additionally, while the grand jury was convened in 2008, the CBI leaked the fact that 2 or possibly 3 unknown DNA profiles were pulled from Jonbenet's underpants, which confuses how important the DNA actually is, considering it's doubtful that 2 or 3 individuals wandered about the Ramsey home that night completely undetected. So again, which DNA profile belongs to the killer and which one or ones are from an innocent source?
Or does she even have the killer's DNA on her?
She might not at all.
She might not have any of it because the killer maybe has gloves on, has a mask on.
She's a tiny little 6-year-old who at some point, I'm going to mention him, but I don't want to. I can't remember his first name. He was a retired detective out of Colorado Springs who came out of
Spitz.
What's his first name? I can't remember his last name.
Detective
And
Spitz?
He believed that she had been hit with a stun gun. Now, Boulder police had different explanations for the marks on her skin. But in which case, if she was hit with a stun gun, she's not fighting back at all. There's no reason for the perpetrator's DNA to be on her skin whatsoever.
And Douglas, I keep mentioning him. I wish I could remember all his accolades of like why this dude is the man when it comes to profiling. But he created a profiling program in the FBI that I believe they still use today. He knows his stuff, and he gives Spitz all the credit in the world. And it's really interesting. Spitz, he had solved a case in a way that was like kind of groundbreaking, and that's why he is such a idolized guy when it comes to this type of stuff and people in those fields. So I say all that to say Spitz knows his stuff way more than Boulder PD, who...
Well, don't go there.
No. This is why I say
because
this.
John Douglas spoke equally as positive.
Absolutely, of detective there. But when we actually look at experience levels, it's very clear everybody in Boulder PD does not have the proper experience to handle a case like this, and for them to say, no, Spitz, his theory is wrong and here's our theory, that I really question. And there's one fact at the time, and it's probably about the same still, outside of a massacre that happened there recently. Outside of that, Boulder at the time averaged 1 murder a year. 1 murder. Like, that's how safe this town is and how little crime happens there. Most of it's probably Boulder or college kids being stupid.
Here's what I'm going to say in response
why would they
to
know?
that has nothing to do with Jonbenet herself. So the lead detective for Boulder PD, a man named Steve Thomas, when not even from his own book, but from another book, when talking to another individual connected with the case, he would say about Steve Thomas, if my child went missing, all I would have to say to Steve is find her. And he would. So I get that Spitz has accolades and you think he's better served. I think Steve Thomas was absolutely capable of solving the case. I think that his hands were tied by political issues.
And all the issues that happened
problems
in the beginning.
that happened before he even stepped on the scene. And so earlier I said that like experts in the field landed on both sides. You literally have on one side Steve Thomas versus Detective Spitz, because we can't remember his name. You have Henry Lee and you have John Douglas. Completely capable individuals of interpreting evidence, seeing it two totally different ways. In 2022, John Ramsey spoke at Comic-Con in support of a change.org petition designed to get Governor Polis, who is currently the governor of Colorado, to intervene and get Boulder PD to allow outside agencies to test the DNA collected, like the companies who test and make connections through genealogical sites. The following November, to that Comic-Con visit, Boulder Police, along with the DA, would issue a press release. In this release, they would call it an, quote, ongoing homicide investigation, and their intention was to consult the Colorado Cold Case Review Team in 2023, end quote. They reiterated that their investigation had explored 21,000 tips, letters, and emails, and that they traveled to 19 different states and had spoken to over 1,000 individuals. They also stated that they are working with the FBI, CBI, Colorado Department of Public Safety, and several private laboratories across the country. And now, well, they are waiting for proven technology to be developed that could reliably test the samples of DNA in their possession. Because now, further testing of the DNA samples could consume what little they have left. And so justice for Jonbenet waits. But in this, although tragic and frustrating, it is not rare. While Jonbenet's case seemingly warranted global attention, perhaps because of the way Jonbenet looked, the wealth of her parents, or the strange little town in which she lived, crimes against children are all too common, and justice often goes unserved. When researching this case, I felt like the Jonbenet story was a choose-your-own-adventure, in which every choice the reader could make had to have made sense at the end. You want it to be Burke Ramsey? Great. Go to page 49. We have a voice at the end of the 911 call and a bowl of pineapple for that. Wait, you want it to be Patsy? Go to page 55. We have a ransom note and several discrepancies in her story. What? You think it was John? Perfect. Turn to page 74. We have speculation around chronic sexual abuse to explain it. Or perhaps you believe it to be an intruder. Well, just turn to page 100. We have a broken window, palm and boot prints, and unexplained cord and tape, which will support all of that. What? You want it to be Santa Claus? Well, turn to page 113. We have a somewhat uncomfortable connection to the child, a previously kidnapped daughter, and a Mrs. Claus who wrote a play almost exactly like what happened to Mrs. Ramsey or to Jonbenet.
That's good.
Okay, so it seems like every hope is pinned on DNA. DNA which may or may not have come from one individual, or two individuals, or even three individuals. DNA which may or may not have gotten beneath Jonbenet's fingernails or on her underpants during the attack. DNA which may or may not have come from the killer. DNA which may or may not be relevant at all. I went into this story, even up to the end of recording part 1, convinced that the killer was living in the home Christmas night 1996. And now I literally have no idea. So I'm going to let my husband tell his theory. And to be honest, it is the only theory, literally, that explains every piece of evidence. And that will be the outro to this episode, which usually is my thing. One of my favorite parts of writing a script is the outro. So this is a belated Christmas present to you, Jason. And you better make it good.
Well, the pressure's on then. You usually go into this so smooth from what we were talking about. And I'm going to just ruin that right now by saying this. But I will tell you, I think the only way we can explain everything and for it all to make sense, sort of, is to separate ourselves from our perceived reality and look to a theorized reality. And that is the theory of the multiverse. So, a part of this theory is that there are parallel universes that look like our reality, but each universe plays out differently. For example, in one universe, you might have brown hair, Katie, you might, and in another, black. And in this one, you have blonde. Mm-hmm. Well, there's also a theory within this one that there might be some way these parallel universes can overlap or leak into each other in a little way. So, perhaps on Christmas Day in 1996 in Boulder, Colorado, multiple universes spilled a part of itself into ours and became our reality. In one universe, Jonbenet was killed by strangulation, and in another by blunt force trauma. And in another one, she was kidnapped, and there was a ransom note left by some evil group. Perhaps in another one, her brother and mother killed her, and all of them covered it up. But for a night, all these universes collided and left us, this world, with a tragic, awful mess where no one piece of evidence or all of it together can be used to solve this case.